International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples is an event that happens every August 9th. On this day, we advocate for Indigenous rights for the different Indigenous populations across the world, as well as advocate for the protection and preservation of Mother Earth. Why August 9th? Back on August 9th, 1982 was the first meeting the United Nations Working Group of Indigenous Populations took place, and since 1994, the UN decided to observe this day as the International Day of the World Indigenous Peoples. Each year has a different theme, and the 2023 theme is Indigenous Youth as Agents of Change for Self-Determination. Across the world, different events take place in celebration for this day. Here at the Indigenous Podcast Without Borders, we are commemorating this day with the release of our first podcast episode that highlights the unique status that Indigenous peoples live with among the U.S.-Mexico border. These Indigenous peoples' traditional territory exists since time immemorial, and now the U.S.-Mexico border crosses their lands. This creates a division between the U.S. federally recognized tribes versus non-recognized tribes, which permeates through family history.
Jose Malvido is a current PhD student at the University of Arizona. He has an MA from San Francisco State University in Ethnic Studies. He is the former Director of Community Services for Chicanos por la Causa. He has served as a Department Director for the Indian Health Center of Santa Clara County, where he oversaw several community wellness and home healthcare programs, including programs that worked on preventing type 2 diabetes, as well as programs that help diabetics live healthier lives. Jose has also served in the capacity as the program manager for the SEVA Foundation and social justice grant making at the San Francisco Foundation. In November 2000, he began his tenure as the North American coordinator of the Peace and Dignity Journeys. In a nutshell, the Peace and Dignity Journeys is an intercontinental spiritual movement which covers the territories from Alaska to Panama. Also known as the PDJ, it works to unite Indigenous peoples throughout North, Central, and South America. Jose also served as vice president to the board of the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples and the treasurer for both the Cultural Conservancy and Sapichai. Jose brings extensive experience in program development, grassroots organizing, and a working management of multiple programs across several countries. What is the difference between federally recognized tribes and non-recognized tribes?
That's a big topic. There's some very clear differences between how the government categorizes Indigenous peoples. I'll go over a few. Federally recognized tribes are native nations that are recognized under the federal government, which is part of the Department of Interior. They have land, they have their customs, they have their languages, and they have a specific territory that in the United States. In other countries, that's a different story. There's also non-federally recognized tribes. Some of them are recognized within this particular state, some are not, and some are unrecognized by others, but they're still sometimes petitioned for federal recognition, or within their culture, within their areas are recognized either by state, county, cities. So it's a little bit complicated because Native peoples are the only folks in the world that have to prove that they're indigenous. There's other cultures around the world that don't have to do that. So this question can be somewhat complicated, but at the same time, by federal laws, there's also aspects where it's simple in that respect.
Yeah. So are there benefits and disadvantages between the two?
Well, there's a lot of misconceptions of the benefits of being federally recognized. A lot of times there's questions of if you're federalized, you get a lot of money from casinos and other revenue streams, and you have all kinds of different benefits. I think there are, in the sense that you are part of a native nation and you do have that connection with your culture. Versus, let's say there's Indigenous peoples from different tribes and are not recognized, or even some that were displaced and live in other cities when they were displaced from their communities. Let's say for the Bay Area Indian community, it's a very strong community, but some working with youth there, unfortunately, some of the youth have less connection to their communities because of being a few generations apart from when their grandparents went to the city. So that's a little bit of a different thing, but non-recognized, it's really difficult to make general statements about federal recognition because every nation, there's a little bit of differences as far as how they're set up, how they're governed, and how the communities are, or the nations are. And the same is with non-recognized. I'll use another example. In the Bay, there's historically Ohlone land, and there's like a small group of folks that are recognized, but there's other families that are part of the Ohlone lineage that aren't necessarily recognized by the government, but they're very active in the community. There's historical proof that they're Ohlone, so it's complicated. And similar in Texas, there's Huahuitecas who are recognized by the state, but they're not federally recognized, so they don't necessarily have, even though some of the historical territories are in South Texas and northern Mexico, there's not any specific land for them. And I think that's the key. If when it comes to Native nations that are recognized, you have a land base. And I think in some ways, even though there's always challenges with maintaining culture, traditions and stuff, there's always a land base that people can connect to. This is my nation, this is my land base, and this is where we're from, and this is where we're located. Folks that are part of unrecognized nations, they have that traditional land base, but unfortunately, there's no treaties, there's no specific land that they can have, and it's either taken up by private property or cities or other things like that. So I think when it comes to cultural preservation, that's also a harder thing to maintain.
Right. And there's that whole aspect of colonization and just unpacking that topic. That in and of itself, it's another part of, it's related to federal recognition and how we're not recognizing certain tribes.
Absolutely. Well, then if you expand it a little bit different within Canada or Mexico or Guatemala, and that's the thing that's really a thing to point out, is that unfortunately Indigenous peoples are identified based on what nation states, countries deem. In Mexico, people have to speak their language, live in their community, how basic, wear their clothes. There's very high standards to what an indigenous person is. And if somebody goes to college or for whatever reason leaves their community and they move to a city, there's a possibility of them not being recognized as indigenous.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really interesting and even challenges to that. So the question of identity and nationhood, it's somewhat complicated, and then it's even more complicated depending on which country we're looking at. But I think with the work that we do with Alianza, as we approach it by directly communicating with the people on the ground, so we build relationships with Native nations or Native communities, whether they're in diaspora from Guatemala or other parts of Central America, or the Native nations here with like the Tohono Nation, Yaqui, Akamaratam, or just other surrounding nations here. We work to build relationships with communities and nations here. Again, it's complicated in a sense, but I think for organizations that are on the ground and have been around for a while, we have good ability to recognize who's who.
Tell us about your family's story in relation to their status as Indigenous peoples who are not a part of a federally recognized tribal group. Is it because they did not enroll like in the base roll, or what exactly happened?
Yeah, I can definitely go into that. Well, first of all, my family have always been rebels and I've gone against the grain. But there's a few more aspects to that. So some of my family members and relatives are enrolled in either Tohono or within Yaqui. But I'll go a little bit into my direct, my parents and grandparents.
Is it Tohono Nation here in the U.S.?
Yes.
And then Pasco Yaqui tribe of Arizona?
Yeah.
Okay.
So where do I begin? My family on my mom's side, it's Yaqui, and my dad's side my nana side is Tohono. However, more recently, some of my relatives in Mexico and Sonora have been working to get recognized, and it turns out my nana, on my mom's side, is also Tohono or Hiacheratam actually. So the family on that side of the border has been going through registration and that process. So my mom, if she decides to enroll in Tohono or Yaqui, she basically has the blood quantum for both, but that hasn't really been something that's been really sought after for my family. I'll go into a story too about my mother's side. So my mom's side, used to be a Yaqui village in Sonora, but the village doesn't actually exist anymore. But the point is, like, so when the Yaquis were fighting against the Mexican government, my family was a lineage of my family lived in that village, but as I mentioned, it doesn't exist anymore. And one of my ancestors, her name is Ketty, and she was a little girl when that was happening, and when that village was attacked. There's stories of the men were thrown in wells, cement were thrown in them, they were taken as prisoners, some people were killed, a lot of the women were taken, and even the little girls. But Ketty, who was a little girl, she hid under the skirt of one of the elders there, and so she didn't get taken. And so because of that, part of my lineage was alive, and it's kind of sad but also an enduring story. That's on my mom's side. And so every once in a while the family does, people that are descended from Ketty, there's like an event and kind of like a memorial, sometimes gatherings about that in my hometown, which is Ajo, Arizona. On my dad's side, who's also Autumn, there's like in Mexico, because my dad lived on both sides of the border, there was a lot of racism. And when my dad was growing up, they had a lot of racism, and it was kind of hard for him. But his mom, my grandma, was gangster. She said who she was, and she...
What time frame? Was this like during the late 1800s or the early...
No, earlier, the 1900s. So my dad, he grew up he was like in the 50s and 60s, like as a youth.
Yeah.
When he was going back and forth.
Your gangster Nana was like early 1900s.
Yeah, yeah, she was around 1900s, and she was tough. She was the person who I learned most about the Autumn culture, and she talked about just history and about native history and Sonora, and so I really felt a lot of appreciation to learn about that from her. But I think my Nana Luisa, I think she was my dad's grandmother. So she was kind of a person that was a traditional, she helped people that were sick and stuff. And when she also came to the US side, and she stopped doing that work because of the racism. Like people made fun of her and that kind of stuff. So in some ways my family didn't, they were like in the Sonora part, like Altar, Quito Vaquito, Quito Vac. My grandmother, my dad's mom, was born in Santana and grew up in Quito Vaquito, which is another traditional Autumn territory. And then they migrated to Sonoita and then eventually Ajo, and kind of went back and forth from Ajo. So, growing up, it wasn't something that, oh, you're native or you're this or you're Mexican or this, you're just who you are. It wasn't until I moved to college or the city to go to school where like, what are you? I'm like, I don't know, I'm just who I am. We're just who we are. Yeah. So it's just kind of funny how identity, or the categorizations of identity, is something that happens in the city. Going back to the whole thing about enrollment, something that some of my family will probably do and some of my family probably won't. Whether or not I do, I'm still thinking about it. I think kind of what I mentioned about being tied to the nation, but at the same time, if you can be dually enrolled, which I think is part of my family, you have to pick one or the other, and you can't both. You can't be enrolled in two nations at the same time. It's kind of a thing, right? Because there's a lot of people out there that can be. That whole thing is blood quantum, right? Which is a U.S. construction to prove that you have. Blood quantum isn't something that is genetic. It's more like a social construct. It was originally created to eliminate Native people.
If you follow blood quantum in your tribe, that means your tribe has an expiration date. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And the blood quantum was adopted from European royalty. How in order to be royalty, you need to continue your bloodline, which means breeding with your family. But so that's being used here, in the tribal context, and that's not traditional to us. We're very conscientious of interbreeding, but now that we have to prove ourselves as indigenous through blood quantum, that's putting us against each other. I mean, it's a brilliant idea to eliminate tribes, but we also need to decolonize our way of thinking and realize that it really doesn't come down to blood quantum.
And the good thing too is many nations in the U.S. are super cognizant of that and have been shifting the way they recognize or enroll tribal members. In some ways, what I think is irrelevant because it's the sovereignty of each nation, so it's up to them to decide how people are enrolled. So it's just super respecting that. You know, you mentioned something about hooking up with a cousin. There's a lot of joke in Indian country about cousins, uncles and stuff, but historically, you know, some of our folks had clans, and that was a way to distinguish who was who, and it's almost like a different place. And some folks like Navajo, Dene, still have that set up where they check out, meet folks, talk about their clans as a way to find out that they're not related. And there's other folks out there that do that. So we have those systems embedded in us. But I think as colonization, as you mentioned, taking land, trying to eliminate in many different ways, that those types of things have eroded. But there's also efforts to restore language, culture, traditions, and connections to land, farming, you know, protection of sacred sites. There's a lot of work that's happening, which is really beautiful and powerful, that Native people have been doing for a long time and continue to do it, whether it's local, regionally, state, nationally, internationally, and even like at the UN level, folks are fighting to support Indigenous sovereignty and rights and everybody's unique original instructions that they have according to their traditional ways. And that's another thing too, like even though there's laws that are kind of generalize what Native people are, Indigenous nations are super diverse. Not only our language, our ways, our customs, traditions, and a lot of folks are land-based, and the ceremonies and traditions are tied specifically to that land. And historically we've recognized each other's territory, and we still do in some ways. In my personal work, and when we do the prayer runs, we recognize not only the federally recognized land, but the traditionally recognized land, which usually is larger than the reservations. Or
that's a good thing you point out with the peace and dignity journeys. Like how does that even relate? Because you're Indigenous, but you're Indigenous to two tribes and to both sides of the border. The U.S.-Mexico border. Yeah. How do you bring that? Because that's you. How do you bring that into the peace and dignity journeys?
Position I was given the role to be the Northern Coordinator, which is from Alaska through Panama. In 2024, it's going to be organizing from Alaska to Colombia. And part of it, I think, is just language. Because I grew up in Ajo, which is a border town, I'm able to speak Spanish too. So I think that helps in organizing in different communities. And I think the other piece is just really fortunate to be exposed to how Indigenous peoples are recognized in the U.S. and Mexico and the differences. There's several different Native communities in Sonora, and in some ways they're recognized differently. And I think having that experience and learning to been able to navigate how to connect with hundreds of Native communities in different countries, talk to them about the run, and have, you know, participation. But the important thing about the journeys is kind of what we talked about, sovereignty, and it's respecting people's sovereignty. So when we do the prayer run, we don't necessarily have one way of doing it. When we do the prayer run, we go in every community we go into our nation, we organize ahead of time. And so they take the lead if they want. So they do this, they carry the sacred staffs that we carry with, they do the run. They basically tell us how to run in their territory. And so that's another way that we show respect to the nations, is because we're not going to go into a nation or community and be, oh, this is how we do ceremony, this is how we do something. So we get guidance from the community or nation, and they tell us how to run. And so we repeat that along the way from Alaska through Panama. And I think that's how we maintain our intertribal relationship, which is another thing which is very different. Intertribal organizing is very different from pan-Indigenous. Pan-Indigenous tends to be something that, let's say there's a lot of people doing Lakota ceremony.
Right.
And I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but people do Lakota ceremonies and all over the world, or Aztec or Mexica. And that could be a way of doing, or even powwows. You know, those are like pan-Indigenous. Like each of those ceremonies or traditions come from a specific land base. And either sharing them with, because sometimes folks have shared their ceremonies, you know, as a way to spread it. Like, for example, the Danza Azteca, it was some things that people don't really know about. Like there was requests or permission given to send it up to the north so that people in the north can learn and to reconnect with traditional ways. There's been other ceremonies that, because they're not mine, I won't speak about them, but that were gifted in Oregon and from Oregon to South Dakota as a way of sharing them. There have been intertribal movements, intertribal ceremonies that have come up. And this kind of gets a little bit complicated because I'm being respectful not to name stuff that isn't something that is kind of why it's my place, but I know about them. But getting back to the whole thing where pan-Indigenous, like blood quantum, was originally created to dilute Native nations' identity. And this goes back to authors and especially in academia, the concept of pan-Indigenous was created to do that. But intertribal is recognizing everybody's sovereignty and who people are, and it's just giving that respect. Like there's Tohono and Yaqui, and there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences, and you can't group Yaqui and O'odham in the same place. You have to respect everybody's turn, or Navajo, or different folks. Like there's different languages, there's different histories.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's really important to recognize people. You're Yaqui, I'm Tohono and Yaqui. Each of those, but it's important to respect each one of those in their own way, because each of them have their language, their land, their traditions, and history. I think that intertribal organizing is a way to do that. And I think when getting back to Alianza, we very much utilize that process to organize with Indigenous peoples. We don't lump people into groups. We recognize everybody's traditional way and who they are, and type of organizer. It's a lot more in depth. There's a lot more human investment. There's a lot more communications. There's a lot more processes, instead of like, hey, we're all going to jump in and go do this and all these natives. That happens too, but that's kind of more a different thing. So the way we do that work is that's why it's an alliance with Indigenous Peoples Without Borders, because we also recognize that going back to traditional territories, there's traditional territories in Mexico and Guatemala, in different parts of Central and South America that may or may not be recognized. Going back into NAFTA, like one of the provisions was to get rid of communal lands where not only where a lot of where Native people had lands. There was other groups that had them, like farmers, but those lands were pretty much got rid of with the passage of NAFTA. So
that's the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah. So working with Indigenous peoples, there's protocols in a sense to work with Native people. So I feel fortunate enough now to have, I don't even know how many years working with Native communities, and I plan to continue to do that. And, going back to family history, going back to my Nana, O'odham side, and there's other Native sides.
Your tough Nana?
My tough Nana. She pretty much gave me some instructions when I was a young person about how to be, what's going to happen, and kind of my role. So in a sense, I've been following that path that she's given me. And it's funny because even within my own family, they didn't get that. But I was really, especially when I was younger, close with her. And when I did my first Priest Dignity run in 96, I spoke to her about it. She gave me her blessings, and that was the last time I saw her. We were in Canada, and at that time we didn't have internet.
Yeah, no cell phones.
We didn't have cell phones.
Right.
We ran according to maps, so we got lost a lot. So it wasn't until Canada that I found out that she had not only passed away, that she was already buried. And so I was trying to figure out whether or not I should come home, and I spoke to my mom, and she said, there's nothing you can do, just pray for her. And luckily, one of the elders, Vivian Sandy from Alkali Lake, she's like a medicine person, and she helped me get through that challenge, really helped me to focus. So I continued to run, and I kept going. So there's a lot of Indigenous history, Native people's history, struggles, wins. There's so much rich history in Native communities, and I think it was Vine Deloria, who's a really well-known author, mentioned that the non-Native world only knows about 10% of the Native world. I think I agree with that.
I'm gonna ask a question about your Nana. Did she know what recognition was? Like, did she know about, people enrolling? Because, I know that the Basco Yaqui tribe of Arizona, they started collecting names for their base roll in the late 70s. I don't know when Tohono O'odham did, but I'm pretty sure it's, the time frame's not too different. Yeah. Did she know about it? Was she like, no, I don't want to be part of this government. No, I don't need paper to prove,
It never came up like that.
No.
The only thing that would come up And again, it's like this whole thing about identifying with something. You know, she just kind of, this is who I am, and so she just kind of like shared some like, but I think there was other native that she had, because she had other languages. I'm like, what is that? You know, and there's always stories that, you know, even on my mom's side, like, you know, like talking about how her nana would sing, and I think it was Yaqui, and she never got, you know, gathering firewood. They never learned that. And, you know, one other thing I didn't mention, you know, on the Yaqui side is my tata. He was like 100% Yaqui too. And he unfortunately passed away when my mom was 14. So that part of like the transmission of the knowledge and history and culture, it kind of it went away like in the 1950s. So my nana never remarried, and that's my mom's side, and that nana, I guess, is the one that is Xachirotam, the one that they're trying to the family in Mexico is trying to get recognition.
Thank you, friends and relatives, for listening to the Indigenous Podcast Without Borders. The music in this episode was called Fruto de Sonora and was composed by Ms. Zoden on SoundCloud. If you are further interested in our organization, you can visit our website at indigenousalliance.org.